The Civil War and Great Depression were the two biggest events in U.S. history, so it's a good idea to pay attention to see what happened. To understand the Great Depression, you need to start in the late 1920s. These were the roaring 20s, good times, full of fun and new things like radios and cars. People borrowed a lot of money. They also borrowed a lot of money to buy stock on Wall Street. Some people realized the good times would not last forever, so they bought less stuff and started selling their stock on Wall Street. Some had trouble paying back the money they owed. Then, in October 1929, they panicked. They sold their stock. The stock market crashed and people lost billions of dollars. Companies ran out of money. They also started laying off their workers. Think of the Great Depression as a process and not just a simple event. Beginning in 1929, conditions became worse and worse. Factories laid off workers because they couldn't sell the stuff they produced. As a result, people had less money to spend, they bought fewer goods, and factories laid off even more workers. These workers had even less money, they bought even less, so factories laid off even more workers. This whole process was a downward spiral, leaving many people with no money and no choice but to sell apples on the street. These pictures give you a good idea of what the Great Depression was like in the early 1930s. As companies went out of business, people lost their jobs. Kids went hungry. Kids got frustrated. Parents got frustrated. Everybody began looking to the government for help. During the Civil War, it was Abe Lincoln who came to the rescue. During the Great Depression, it was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR, who came to the rescue. FDR was a Democrat. He served as president for 4 terms. That means he was elected president 4 times between 1933 and 1945. He led America not only during the Great Depression, but also even World War II, which was an enormous challenge for the country also. These photos from the past show Roosevelt at some radio microphones, show a button from his campaign, and show one of hundreds of newspaper headlines with FDR as the country's new leader. Roosevelt had a clear plan to help the country deal with the Great Depression. It was called the New Deal. The New Deal consisted of a series of government agencies, or parts of the government, designed to solve specific problems faced by farmers, bankers, workers, young people, African Americans, and many others. The purpose of the New Deal was mostly to use government's resources to solve some of the problems created by the Depression. Another purpose of the New Deal was to keep people from getting too unhappy with their country. Elsewhere in the world, people were turning to terrible leaders like Hitler in Germany and Stalin in the Soviet Union to help them deal with the problems of the Great Depression. One of the first of the New Deal agencies was the Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC. The purpose of the CCC was to give young men jobs. They were put to work building roads, building schools, planting forests, helping preserve the country's natural resources, and building what's called infrastructure, roads and bridges. One of the most important of the New Deal agencies, or new parts of the government, was the WPA, or Works Progress Administration. Its purpose was really just to put a lot of people back to work, including artists, writers, and playwrights. More than 8 million people were put to work through the WPA on roads, bridges, parks, airports, and public buildings. Tens of thousands of artists were put to work painting murals, creating travel books, making sculpture, and so on. This picture shows a mural painted in a post office in Downers Grove, Illinois. You can see hundreds of murals and works of art like this throughout the country even today. The purpose of the art was not just to give the artists work, but also to give Americans some pride in their past and strong feelings of solidarity and strength in the present. And during the Depression, the present moment was very, very difficult. Some of the achievements of the New Deal are too big to miss. Here is a dam being built in one of the Appalachian states. It was created in the late 30s by the Tennessee Valley Authority, whose purpose was to provide cheap electricity to millions of people in Alabama, Georgia, Kentucky, and other Appalachian and southern states. Those people needed electricity and work. These projects also had the purpose of controlling flooding and preserving natural resources. Social Security also got its start during the Great Depression. The Social Security Act of 1935 gave older people financial security after retirement. This means that the elderly would have the resources to live after retirement. These days, Social Security is used for other purposes, including support for people with disabilities. During the years of the Great Depression, things were especially rough for farmers in the Great Plains state. Another problem in the 30s for farmers was the Dust Bowl. Conditions were even worse for farmers in parts of the Great Plains than they were in other parts of the country. Lack of rain for several years, plus poor farming practices, led to a destruction of surface vegetation, erosion, and huge dust storms in the 1930s. Basically, since World War I, farmers had been planting too much. They'd been overproducing. Prices had gotten really low. They were over-farming the land, and the land was beginning to fall apart. A variety of New Deal programs helped farmers. Farmers were taught how to prevent erosion and use fertilizers. These were some of the problems that led to the Dust Bowl. The Agricultural Adjustment Act paid farmers not to plant corn, wheat, peanuts, tobacco, and other crops. By overplanting these crops, prices had gotten too low for farmers to stay in business. The government's solution was to pay farmers not to plant. And finally, the Farm Security Administration was put in place to lend money to farmers who didn't have enough for machines, tools, and seeds. This helped poor farmers throughout the Great Plains states as well as in the South, where there were many sharecroppers. Behind the scenes was FDR's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor didn't sleep. She was everywhere. She wrote, spoke, traveled, kept her husband informed about the problems of women, blacks, the workers, especially miners during the Great Depression. Eleanor was a real hero of this period, and here you see her in several photos. In the middle of the page, you see her with miners in West Virginia. On the right, you see her with the great black singer Marian Anderson. Marian Anderson was prohibited from singing at a concert hall in D.C. because it was segregated. Thanks to Eleanor Roosevelt, she was able to sing instead at the Lincoln Memorial in 1939 at a very famous concert, which you can hear on YouTube. People, in fact, saw Eleanor as a friend in the American government. You see her on the left speaking with a young African-American girl. It was not typical for blacks and whites to appear together in photos in many parts of the country. Eleanor had tremendous courage, and on the right is a letter written to her by a 5-year-old girl whose daddy couldn't afford to buy her a Shirley Temple doll. Would Eleanor send her one? She received many letters like this, and she also responded to them. How did the Great Depression end? The answer is simple. War started in Europe again in 1939. Remember, there had been war in Europe, the Great War, World War I, 20 years earlier. This time the war was started by Hitler, the Germans. It was a terrible war. America started selling goods to Britain. Britain was one of the countries fighting the Germans. Selling goods helped business and put people back to work. This government plan was called Lend-Lease. Then America was attacked by Japan, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Now America's war effort really geared up. We went to war. Millions of men and women were called to serve the country. Factories and businesses had plenty of work selling to the government, so much work, there was now a need for workers that couldn't be filled. There were jobs for everybody. The Great Depression was over.